Welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast, a collection of conversations about the open source ecosystem. We speak with maintainers and companies that play a key role in ensuring the health and sustainability of open source today and in the future. Hey, Zack, and welcome to the Mechanical Ink podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. This was a really quick one. I saw something you posted and it was like, I think a week and we're having a conversation. So it's really, really, really cool. So
yeah, it's like a scheduling miracle.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if anybody listening to the podcast knows about scheduling meetings, you know how amazing that is to do that across time zones and, you know, people working at different places. That is a miracle. But all right. So, to start it off with, please tell us more about yourself, your background, how you came to do what you do, and what gets you up in the morning.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Zack Koppert. So I guess if we look back at the beginning of my professional career, just to kind of understand where I'm coming from. I studied electrical engineering, and now I'm doing software. So I count myself in the group of people who shifted into software from somewhere else, just like a special trial. If you've ever been through it, you know what I'm talking about. So I got started actually in right out of college doing embedded software. So software that's running on low-level hardware, microprocessor, and all that kind of stuff. Versus traditional like web apps and stuff that other software folks might be used to. I started at Tektronix doing that. I worked there for like 7 years doing, started with software engineering and then moved into architecture, tried out engineering management, and moved into innovation programs, which was super fun. And then I eventually started an open source programs office there at Tektronix. One of the things I've also done that's sort of like tangentially related, but not necessarily like a work related item is being a part of Coding Coach and doing some mentoring. So that's actually one of the ways that I've got to meet some people from all over the world. That's been really cool. Networking is not like a first-hand skill for me. It's not for, necessarily one of my strengths. So I really love being able to be a part of Coding Coach and connect with people that I wouldn't have normally. So got to work with folks from Brazil and the Philippines and all over the US and stuff. So, so it's fun to mentor folks there. And if you've ever done mentoring, I'm sure you know that like, mentoring is like maybe a false image of what it really goes like. It's really two people learning from each other. So both students, and so I've learned a ton from folks there, and got to help some folks get some jobs in tech too, which has been fun. After Tektronix, I started working at GitHub. I've been here for 3 years now, and I absolutely love it. It's honestly my dream job. So, as somebody who's really into open source, working at GitHub is like a really special, amazing thing. I feel like I've got some great connections too. I've got to meet people that work at GitHub that the depth of their knowledge and time spent in open source is just amazing. To be able to even interact with them, I feel honored. So that's been great. The other thing about GitHub, and this kind of goes into my motivation, what gets me up in the morning is just that it's been a really perfect balance for me of like being able to do software engineering work and being able to also focus on open source and inner source inside of GitHub, but then also with customers. So, part of my driving factors are like, well, I really want to help people. My very first job was at Office Depot as a computer tech. and people like walked in like, my data is gone, help me, or, or I have a virus and I need to do this thing and my taxes or whatever. Like, and, I would work on their computer and they would leave happy. Like it turned their day around. It felt like to me, and I've been chasing that ever since. So, that feeling has been really important for me to continue like working with GitHub customers and making an impact on open source bigger than just at a single company. And GitHub's enabled me to do that. So, so I really like that. And it's kept me balanced. So instead of job hopping, right? Like I was mentioning the balance about working with customers or doing software engineering work or all the different program work that I've done, I'm able to do all of them sort of at the same time without having to like constantly look for new jobs. So it's been super cool.
Great stuff. I've been on both sides of the coin with mentoring, and it's definitely not what people think. It's not like you come to the mentor with all your coding problems and they solve them magically and you go away and you're it's definitely it's about more than just the code. It's sometimes just about like somebody might feel like, I don't know if I'm the right person for tech, and you can talk through that with them. Like, why do you feel that way? And you can share your experience of maybe being in that same situation or having mentored other people that's gone through the same thing. So a lot of it is sometimes even a majority of it is not even about like, my JavaScript doesn't work. It's like about so much more than that. Yeah, very interesting. So before we dig into like the main topic of the conversation, there's something very, very related that I read on your website, and that is, so in the questions say previous employer, but seeing that you've mentioned Tektronix, so at Tektronix you started the OSPO there, and I'm always curious about that. I think there are a couple of, it seems like more companies are getting more interested in this. Like, what is an OSPO and why would we want one, and that kind of thing. And then maybe somebody inside starts explaining, like, this is what it does, and it's kind of important, and this, that. So when you were doing this whole thing, like at this company, what was your approach to it? What are the key selling points, if I can phrase it that way, when you're approaching your employer and saying, like, I think this is a good idea, and this is why I think that it's a good idea? Yeah,
so that's such an interesting one to answer. I feel like this kind of connects to what you were talking about with mentoring, right? Is that it's almost more about having empathy and sharing the technique of how to do something that you might know how to do, rather than actually doing it for them, right? We're not fixing JavaScript code. We're talking about approach to debugging, right? If we're getting into technical weeds for mentoring, right? And it's the same thing for OSPO, right? So OSPO solves Open Source Programs Office, right? OSPOs. They solve so many different problems for different people, even though it's the same vehicle, right? So for me at Tektronix, it was, I listed a bunch of reasons in that post about like things I said, we're going to, lower development costs and reduce time to market and reduce security and legal risk and that kind of stuff, right? But that wasn't necessarily like the reason why they wanted to do it. They're like, okay, yeah, all these good things, all these benefits. But as I was describing things about the way that I saw the current situation in engineering, I'm seeing these trends, I'm seeing these habits in our engineering. And, I've been in these different groups in large and small sizes, and I see it all over the place. And as I was describing those, what I think really hooked the engineering leadership and the company's leadership is that they recognized that they wanted a culture change, and that OSPO was going to be a vehicle to do it, and that I was volunteering myself to be, to put that responsibility on my shoulders, that they could check in with me in a month or in 6 months or a year and say, well, you took responsibility for this. How is it going? And so I think framing it that way really helped. But the lesson that I've taken away from that to help others start OSPOs and things like that is that I really had a lot of authenticity in why I wanted to do this, and then a lot of relevance of like, not this is what's going on in the industry. Everybody's starting an OSPO, which may be true. And, other competitors have OSPOs, any of that kind of external environment stuff. But internally, we had problems in engineering that we wanted to solve, and we were going to use this to solve those. And so I had that authenticity and relevance that made the proposal sticky, so to speak, in terms of the minds and hearts of the leadership there. And again, this is my understanding. As a person putting out the proposal, they may have said, I was just tired of hearing him talk, so I said yes. I don't know. Have to ask them for that side of things. But that's my understanding.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Using it as a vehicle for change, the change that you want, that's very, very interesting. Huh? I haven't thought about it that way.
Okay. Yeah, and there are certain changes that. Mm-hmm. Oh, I was just going to say there are certain changes, right, that OSPO is particularly good at, decreasing legal or security risk or different things like that, or, inner source more the development costs and time to market. Well, open source too, I guess there. But yeah, if the shoe fits, I guess, is to quote the fairy tale, right?
Yeah. And we're going to dig into this topic a lot more going further in the podcast. But I want to step to the side a little bit and touch on some other things before we dig into that. So one project that I've stumbled upon again now when I looked up on the stuff that you work is this GitHub action called Superlinter, but it's more than a GitHub action. But so I've looked at it before and I was like, this looks interesting, and then got distracted, and then now I stumbled on it again. So I was like, okay, I'm going to ask the person who works on this, what's the deal? What is Superlinter, and why should one use for it? When should you use it, for example? When might it be too much? And then after that, just maybe we can touch on how can people get involved with the project? How can people contribute to it and that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I can tell you about what it was intended for, but often when you create something, people use it for whatever they want, so, and find other uses for it. And that's definitely been something that's happened. But so this wasn't originally created by me. This was created by a coworker of mine that I sort of paired along with, because he came to me and kind of said, hey, I've been told that you know how to do this open source thing, and that's what I want to do with this project. And so that's kind of how I got involved in it and helped out with the maintainership part of it. So so from what he's told me, he created the Superlinter as a way to be able to pretty much instantly or very quickly get set up with a bunch of linters that are applicable to your project that you're working on. So a lot of people who maybe work on let's say a JavaScript project, they might go, well, that's neat, but I could also just set up an ESLint or something else like that, some other action that lints my JavaScript for me and fixes my issues. The real claim to fame, so to speak, or uniqueness of the Superlinter is that if you've got a monolithic application with lots of different languages, lots of parts and components and things in there, or maybe it's not a monolith, but it has a lot of different languages in the repo. What Superlinter is really good at is you use the same action. No matter what language you're set up with, it'll detect the languages that your project has. And some people think oh, well, I only have JavaScript. Well, do you have Markdown? It's not really a programming language, but it's a documentation language, right? So anyways, it'll detect all these languages for you that you have in your code and then get you set up with sort of what we would consider the industry standard linter and the industry standard configuration for that. And so it's a really good way to just sort of I want to click the button and have linting set up. And if folks don't know, linting, since we've been talking about it for a little bit, is just being able to have something go through your code and automatically check for, either what would have been compiled errors or different kind of gotchas, security things, formatting and style. And that's really nice when you're working on a group project like a lot of software is. Because not everybody agrees on style. And so then you get this one file or one project with like tons of different coding styles in it. It's really hard to read. And so linting helps keep all of that really nice and clear and consistent. And then also, you know that it's valid code in terms of functionally compilable.
That's super cool. I didn't know about the fact that it detects the languages and then like applies the appropriate linters. That's really cool. I wonder, like I said, if I'm correct here, so if I'm not, please tell me, but it is more than just a GitHub action, because my first question is, okay, cool. So when I open a pull request, it'll run these linters, but what do I do locally while I'm like coding away in VS Code? Can I have it locally also so it can kind of check there?
Yeah, there is a local setup, but it's not, let's just say it's not awesome. It's more for development purposes and things like that. So the workflow that the superlinter was sort of meant to work with is that like, and this is the workflow that we use at GitHub a lot when we're writing code on GitHub, is that we will write code and do very, very small commits of code. And those small commits, before they're really ready, even for anyone to look at, will be pushed up to GitHub into a draft pull request. And once that draft pull request is there, actions are already running and already checking things for you. And it's sort of nice because that even happens in the background while you like continue working on your next commit locally. Your action is running and letting you know and giving you feedback and all that stuff. So, so I find that superlinter is really good in helping you get set up and the first time on a project and helping keep your code that merges in consistent. But it is missing that piece where it's really like has those local linters set up. But in VS Code, if you look at the superlinter and say, okay, well, the superlinter is using these things with this configuration, I can just copy those locally and then run that code locally with the VS Code plugin or something like that. I've done projects where it's like I've got a new technology that I'm working with, like Docker or something. Well, new to me technology. Sorry, Docker. And I just don't understand it. I don't understand the format, and I'm really just sort of hacking my way through the forest, right? And getting that set up and getting the linter set up for that specifically is like, okay, well, which linter do I use and what configuration? So superlinter sort of solves that problem for you. And then once it's got that set up, then you can sort of copy paste into local.
Cool. So yeah, so maybe that's like a contribution opportunity for somebody if they want to try and see if there's a little like npx blah blah, and it like copies all your linting rules to your local machine, something like that, and you can check it into source control. Maybe? Yeah, definitely welcoming contributions. So. Awesome. Talking about GitHub Actions, I wrote a little GitHub action just to welcome first-time contributors to a project. Like if you open your first issue or you get your first pull request opened. I mean, there's quite a few of these, but it was more like I wanted to learn how to write a GitHub action. It was a little tough, to be honest. The hardest part is testing it. Like, does it do what I want it to do? Like, would it comment on every single issue, or would it just do it on the first one? So I'm just curious if you are aware of any like tools, best practices, guides, anything that can help people if they want to write like GitHub Actions to make it a little easier, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great call out in terms of trying to learn GitHub Actions. And I remember this vividly because of all the bumps and bruises I have from trying to learn GitHub Actions myself and asking colleagues like on the Actions team, okay, I'm trying to debug this. What the heck do I do? Like, am I really, doing local development, pushing it up, waiting for the action to run, looking at the logs and trying to connect those back to my local development to scratch my head and say what happened or, all these things. And so it is something that can be difficult, and it's been difficult for me. The things that I looked at to get started from like a ground zero, I heard about GitHub Actions and I'd like to try, is looking at the documentation. So that's the docs.github.com, quick start on Actions, and that'll like walk you through step by step and then type this, and then type this. And now you have an action that does this. So you can sort of see the inner workings. And then that obviously sparks most people's curiosity of and what if I change any one of those things? And then I could have an action that does something a little different. And you build from there. The other thing to help you from that ground zero point is that there's a guide, which is different than the docs. So it's still at docs.github.com, but then it's at /actions/guides. And that walks you through the more of the configurability and possibilities with examples around GitHub Actions. And that's helped. And then the other thing that I'll say too is that I used the docs to try and learn GitHub Actions. And but the two things that I sort of learned along the way was one, I think I learned better from videos than docs. So if I wish that there were more YouTube videos out there on GitHub Actions and creating actions, and I think maybe it's my age, but I haven't been on Twitch and watched people live code actions or anything like that, but I heard that's a thing. And so that probably would have been helpful. And then also the other thing was the pattern that I noticed other Hubbers, GitHub people doing was they would have a repository dedicated to testing out that action. And so they were really going through this full almost development cycle, even as they were testing code, right? So they would try to change something, put that in the action, upload it to the action, deploy that action to a repository that called it, and then watch to see what happens. And I found that extremely helpful once I integrated that into my workflow. I'm much more of a test-driven development person. And so ship it and then see what happens. So it felt really backwards to me. But with actions, at least I've sort of learned that that's the way to go.
Yeah, cool. So, so there's definitely room here for improvement. I've also tried to use a tool called, I keep getting the name wrong, so I hope I get it right this time. I think it's called Act, which is supposed to allow you to run your actions locally. And it comes with it has this Docker container that has all the things that your runner would have when it's running on GitHub. But I've had mixed results with it, and I 100% believe it's me and not Act. I just need to figure out how to use it properly, maybe. I'm not sure, because I was trying stuff and then I was I'm not sure if this works, because then it seemed to work with Act, and then I'd push it up and it would fail. I was oh, goodness gracious, where am I going? So it's interesting. It's definitely, but I agree with you on the other point as well, with regards to having, in general, educational stuff in different modalities, because I've come across a number of people that is I just can't sit and read docs all day. I just cannot. I need to watch somebody do this and follow along kind of in my own little editor. So that would be super. So if there's people listening to this who's made actions or write GitHub Actions a lot, hey, make some videos. It'd be awesome. So that's great. But I think there's some really nice advice that you've had in there that can help people. Definitely. So, getting into the meat of the salad, I don't know, of this, of the conversation. How this came to be is because you shared a post on the to-do group Slack where you announced the blog post that many people probably have read by now, but GitHub basically open sourcing everything related to how GitHub runs an open source program office. So before we dig into the details, perhaps we can start with the why. So why did GitHub decide to do this? And then there's another blog post that I believe is linked from this one that talks about 5 reasons why organizations should invest in open source. A big topic all by itself, so feel free to touch on that as little as you want, and we'll focus more on the why for now.
Sure. So as much as this is 100% GitHub doing this open source work around their policies and procedures and guidelines and stuff for how we do open source as a company, it is also 100% a passion project of mine to be able to do this, because it brings me sort of full circle to back when I was trying to start an OSPO. I had these engineering problems about, silos and developers that reported to me that were trying to code their own web server. And I thought, gosh, there's a bunch of them out there. Probably better use of time just to grab one of those than spend the next 9 months writing this. So, I was trying to connect those problems to, okay, how do I use an OSPO to solve this problem? And how do I get started with my own OSPO? Like, where am I going to get the guidelines for what you should do before you release a project, or legal advice on like which licenses we should allow? Like, oh my gosh, this is also out of my league. Just because I can recognize the problem doesn't mean I necessarily have the skill set to be able to solve the problem through creating an OSPO. It's a lot of work with a lot of different skill sets in it, right? Like legal and compliance and program work and developer perspectives about this has got to be easy, otherwise developers aren't going to do it. And then also company communication. How do I get the word out to everybody about what the OSPO is doing, what our new policies are? How do I make sure everyone knows about that and understands it and knows where to ask questions, all those things? So it's a huge learning curve for me. And so in doing that, I had found the to-do group, and OSCON was coming up as well in Portland, where I live. And so I grabbed a ticket to that as well. And I reached out to Chris DeBona from Google, or who was at Google at the time, as I think their open source lead, and said, "Hey, I'm going to OSCON. I'd love to meet up with you and chat. I'm trying to figure out about how to start this OSPO thing at my company, putting together a proposal, and we've had some talks, and I'd love your advice about how this actually gets done, since you're somebody that runs an OSPO on, sort of on the other side of this problem that I'm at." And I, to my absolute and complete shock and amazement, he was like, "Yeah, sounds cool. Let's meet up. Here's my number and stuff." And so I got to meet with him, and it was incredibly insightful, totally down to earth guy that I will forever appreciate having that conversation with, because it's changed my professional life, and so I got to chat with him, and he mentioned that, up on our website at opensource.google, we have all of our internal documentation. And I swear somebody had to like clean up the drool off the floor when he said that, because I was shocked. Like, wait a minute, all this stuff that I'm trying to figure out, you mean you've literally open sourced it? It's in like a CC BY something or other license on their website. And you go there and it's like, oh yeah, this is like the documentation that they use. Now it's got redactions for like, email so-and-so at Google to let them know that you are open sourcing this so they can write a blog post or announce it or something like that, let the media folks know. And so it's got a little redaction in that email address, but everything around it of, hey, maybe you should contact marketing. Like, this is so great. This is everything that they do at scale for all their projects, and so, there was some of the stuff in there that was at a scale that we didn't really need that amount of structure for. But man, that was a huge jumping off point for me to be able to say, okay, I'm sitting down with legal, engineering leads, and other folks. I've got this Google documentation that's been open sourced on how to run an OSPO and how they run it. I've modified it for what I think Tektronix needs. Take a look and let's review this together and, sort of redline things and figure out what we want to change. And, I would probably still be there today trying to come up with all this stuff if that hadn't been available, right? So that was just such a huge boon to me and so impactful for us to get started and to get started well with such high quality. And so it's been really important for me working on this project where GitHub wants to open source it. So we're not the first, obviously, in this area. Like I just mentioned, Google's got their stuff out there as well. We take a different approach on things. Google is very large, has a lot of structure around, and good amount of procedure, which is great. A lot of companies and organizations love that. GitHub is a little confused because it thinks it's still a startup. So it sort of runs in a much more fast and loose type of way, at least compared to companies like Google and other ones that I've been at. We have a lot less policy. So it's almost an alternative, right? So like, here's the Google flavor, here's the GitHub flavor of how we run an OSPO. And there's probably a flavor out there for everybody about how they want to run their OSPO. Hence we open source it, you adapt it to what works for you and what makes sense for you, right? But yeah, that's part of the why. That's my personal why, and why we're doing this project. I think that the GitHub why is really around, GitHub strives to be the home for open source. And the home for all developers. And so with that, like OSPO is really an extension of that mission in like, we're not just including the person who develops open source in their spare time or for a part of their job. We're including companies, right? Companies need some organization and structure around how they interact with open source. And so we're bringing them into the fold and saying GitHub is your home too. And you can do open source and OSPO and all that on GitHub. And so in releasing this, we're hoping to help accelerate people's journey in starting their OSPO and to help reduce that barrier between companies and open source, where companies sort of go like, open source sounds scary. When you say open source, I can think of all the things I shouldn't open source, right? And all of the things that would, release a competitive advantage or internal IP that should be protected or, I don't know. I think there's a reason why maybe open source isn't big in accounting, because those are things you're not supposed to release, like the numbers and that kind of stuff. So, so trying to reduce that barrier and trying to bring organizations towards open source. And I think my understanding of it, at least, is that means not only getting open source companies to open source things and use open source, but also behind like the world of open source, or maybe underneath the world of open source, there's this foundation of like shared values. And I say shared loosely because everybody sort of holds on to it differently, but transparency and collaboration are something that maybe you wouldn't think of as being highly valued at more of a lockdown tech shop that you work at. But in open source, they're everything, right? If an open source project isn't open to collaboration and they're not transparent about things and parts of their code are hidden, well, it's not really open source, is it? Like, that just doesn't even make sense to us. But all of a sudden in a company setting, it's like, oh, of course that makes sense. And I think we take on the sort of military in companies. We often take on the sort of military principle of least privilege, right? Or maybe not military, but security principle of least privilege, where, well, if you don't need to know how this code works or that it exists, then you don't need to know. So we're not going to tell you. And open source inside of companies is sort of like, hey, we're going to give you awareness of things at the appropriate level. Maybe we're not going to give every employee the encryption key algorithm to our product. Maybe that's a little bit more, okay, that's going to be inner circle stuff. But there's a lot of stuff that people use to do their job, to create their product, whatever it is, write their service, that can be shared. And I know firsthand that when I was doing this at Tektronix, that they've shared code across their platform that has ended up making their products that they offer to different, they have like a basic education model. They've got intermediate and advanced stuff. And it's made the whole product line more consistent. You can go from one product to the next and you have that feel of like, oh, I bet I do this, right? To modify the settings, or I bet I go here to change that. And if they weren't sharing the same code, if the company didn't adopt that sort of transparency to be able to know what different departments are doing, if those engineers weren't collaborating, they'd have different products.
Yeah, for sure. I've definitely encountered that. Like way back when I worked at some like large telecoms, it was constantly like doing this thing and being like, wait a minute, the people who built that has a similar thing. Why aren't we using that? And it's like, oh, but the systems are incompatible. It's like, okay. It seems like we're doing a lot of duplicate work here. Not even duplicate, like, triplet. 3 times the same thing, 4 times the same thing. It's like, yeah, so I can definitely see that alone is already a huge benefit. And by the way, small world. So I'll be speaking to Chris on the podcast pretty soon.
Oh,
Chris
awesome.
DeBona. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, and he is so nice. Like I was a little afraid to reach out to him because, like this is the dude who started the OSPO at Google, ran it for 18 years, and all the other things that he's done. When I started reading up about him, it was like, holy cow, he's been in this forever. But I thought I'd try, and he's just so nice. It was just like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And I was like, okay, let's do it. So yeah, that podcast will come up soon.
Awesome.
Now, in the README for the OSPO repository, it references the opensource.guide, which is also a web property that's run by GitHub. How do these two relate to each other? Is it like a complementary thing?
Yeah, good question. We had to figure that out too. We first wanted to do this because it was like, well, shouldn't this information about doing an open source program go on open source guide? And shouldn't we incorporate it in there? And as we started to dig into that, it felt like, well, open source guide feels a lot more like that. I was talking about that barrier between companies and open source. It feels a lot more from the perspective of someone who understands open source, because we use language like, open source maintainer and, starting a project and building a community and different stuff like that. Those are not corporate terms, right? When you're talking to companies about open source, they talk about words, they use words, I'll say it, like compliance and, open source releases and stuff like that. And not as much community building and that kind of stuff. So it's a different language and it's a different perspective. And so what we wanted to do is separate those two things a little bit. And in the future, we may work on combining those two things and figuring out a way to sort of ask the user or something like, do you come at this from an individual open source perspective, or is this on behalf of a company perspective, and sort of, light mode, dark mode switch type of thing for that. I don't know, but for right now, we're separating them. So that's sort of the difference between them. Since the GitHub OSPO repo is much more for the corporate organization company working in open source.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so we're not going to jump into each folder within the repository, but there is one folder that was really interesting to me. So I have like a couple of questions about that one. So the docs folder, I had a look at that, and so one of the documents talks about archiving a repository, and so I work with the MDN WebBlocks project, and we spent quite a large part of 2022 cleaning up the org, like the MDN GitHub org, and part of that was archiving repositories because there was like a ton of them, and it's so hard to maintain when you've got so many repositories. Like you have to ask yourself the question at some point, doesn't make sense for this to not be archived, because what does it mean if it's not? What is our responsibility as an organization to this repository if it's not archived, and how does our responsibilities change once we do archive it? And that alone was quite the thing to define and codify in actual words. So I think so there's a sentence in that document that says, let it sit until you receive confirmation from a maintainer or an adequate length of time has passed. Now, I was going to ask you, like, what is an adequate amount of time? But that's impossible to answer because it's so project dependent. So I'm not going to ask that question. But I think, I think the larger one is, who needs to be notified? And again, there's as you mentioned with the OSPO repo being at the moment very focused on like speaking to corporate companies. So the MDN project isn't so much a corporate company. It's more like just a big open source project that happens to have a lot of individual repositories. So who you tell is also different here. But in general, like when you think about, okay, we should consider archiving this repository, like what is the process around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that there's the resources that you mentioned in the GitHub OSPO repository. There's also some information on the opensource.guide web URL on archiving projects. So yeah, beyond that though, when you're considering archiving something, notifying people is like only one checkbox, right? In the like, how do we do this in the decision tree? And you mentioned that. So when I'm thinking about archiving things, I'm thinking about what's motivating me to archive something. Do I not want to maintain this anymore? Is it old? And by old, do I just mean it hasn't had a commit in a long time, or maybe the technology is sort of irrelevant? If I had an open source tool for GeoCities sites specifically, then that wouldn't be so relevant anymore. And so, I try and think about like what's motivating me to do this, and that helps drive my decisions about archiving or not archiving. But, it's interesting that you mentioned too that the archiving and codifying in words all of the decision around archiving and what that means or what you're committed to as an organization, open source or not, it is intentionally freeform from my understanding. So, I think before being able to actually archive a repository on GitHub, there was just sort of this understanding of like, oh, there hasn't been a commit in 5 years. Don't use that, and just every open source developer sort of had this knowledge in their head somehow. I don't know how they disseminated that, but common sense maybe. GitHub wanted a way to be able to signal to folks like, hey, red flag, maybe don't use this, or cautiously consider using this specific repository or project. And archiving sort of signals that, right? So, I think the more on the communication side of things that you touched on though, in terms of who do we tell and how long do we give notice? It sort of scales with the size, right, of an impact of the open source project. So if, let's say, there's a super big open source project that's got a formal organization, formal maintainers, and like funding coming from a foundation, like there's probably a lot of folks to notify, and you should probably give a lot of time, like on the order of 6 months to a year. And if you're in that boat and find yourself like considering archiving something of that scale, I'd encourage you to look at the Atom project by GitHub. And so they've used their blog, but also their product as a way to notify users and contributors and supporters. So they've actually built into the product notifications about how, okay, this product is no longer going to be supported after this date. And then written blogs about, okay, we're choosing to sunset this, and this is why, and this is our perspective, sort of get that like human part of the message out versus just, your service is shutting down, too bad, bye, like robot AI overlord type of vibe. Kind of. Yeah,
so don't ask ChatGPT how to do that.
Exactly. Or specifically ask it to do it in a human tone and see how good that comes out. I don't know. So communication is really hard. And ultimately, I think I've learned to, like, no matter how good you think you are at communication and that you've like either covered everybody or written the communication a certain way, that's only the outgoing, the transmitting message. the receiver has to decode that message that you've just put out there, right? And so the open source user, the open source contributor to that project, the maintainer of that project, like the sponsor financially of that project, all of these people, the company that relies on it, maybe somebody's got a bunch of plugins for that thing that you wrote, and they use that to get their job done. That's a lot of work you just asked them to do by saying, well, I'm not going to maintain this anymore. And that's why I think like exploring options of ownership is an interesting thing to think about when you're archiving, because maybe it's just that you don't want to do this anymore, or you don't have the resources, or it's not in, like for GitHub, it's not in our roadmap. We have, Visual Studio Code now that we're a part of Microsoft, and that's our IDE of choice. If we're not in the game of competing with ourselves about IDEs. And so it just makes sense for us, to consolidate. But that doesn't mean it makes sense for some Atom user, right? So anyways, yeah, I just think that with that communication, you've got to be really thoughtful and really human in it. And even then, there's no guarantees about how folks are going to feel about it. But that's open source, right? You can tell somebody like, oh, great feature request, I'll work on this later, and they could still be upset. Like, you're not working on it now. And you just have to have a certain learned toughness of like, well, that upsetness is their responsibility. I'm not going to personally take that on as like, oh, I'm so stressed, I have to get this done for this person. That idea of you don't owe them anything, but paired with, you still want to be collaborative, right? There's a balance.
For sure. Yeah. And I while you were talking about that, I remember that we actually have, like, on the stuff I do with WebDocs, we have a project there that is in this like limbo stage at the moment, because it's tricky to notify the people, because it's the MDN data repository, and one of the projects that depend on it is CSS Tree, which is a massive project that's, again, used by a ton of other things. But they only depend on a really small part of MDN data. And the reason why we want to archive it is because on the MDN project, we're moving away from that and moving towards a similar thing that is built by the W3C. And it's maintained by them. So it's going to be it's going to be closer to the source of truth than what the MDN project is. Like, we are at least one step removed. Like, they are changing the specifications, so it can be part of their workflow to update that specific repository and tool. But it's not easy to get hold of people at CSS Tree that run and maintain all of that stuff, because these are all folks doing it in their free time. So, we've explored different things. Like, for example, we made a release specifically and updated the README with like a big call out at the top saying, we are thinking of archiving this. And then that gets pushed as an NPM release. So now you get an NPM thing, like there's a new version, and you get hopefully Dependabot, like opening a PR, and it's right there. If you open up the changelog, you'll see right there, oh, okay. And then we say, like, point it to our GitHub discussions and like, please contact us there. And this is how long, basically, I think we decided on a year in the end, like next year, if nobody is opposed to it. And we presented the alternative of this tool from W3C. So I think that worked out nicely in the end, but it shows you how much consideration and thinking goes into archiving just like one repository. And I mean, that's one of what used to be about 120 repositories. That is what it took to make all the decisions around just that one. So, it's no small thing. It's like, you have to take it seriously.
Absolutely. And when people take it seriously, that's what's really great about seeing open source survive and thrive, and not sort of fall into this tragedy of the commons that a lot of folks talk about, where it's just like, you got this unruly, unmaintained mix of things that are somewhat maybe functional or might have been abandoned and you don't know, and all that kind of stuff, right? The untended garden. Yeah,
for sure. So talking about untended garden, So also one of the things that's touched in one of the docs in the docs folder is about your organization's presence on GitHub. So like, I don't know how many people know about the .github repository and what its role is in a GitHub organization. I discovered it by looking at GitHub's one, and I was like, how does GitHub make their org page look so freaking cool? And I dug a little bit, and I found, there's a .github thing, and you can put stuff, and then it shows up there. So now the MDN one also looks really nice and is very inviting, and I think that makes a big, big difference when you land on that page. So what would you say are some of the most important aspects of an organization's profile? So as you go to github.com/MDN, like what is important for people to see there?
Yeah. Okay. So big disclaimer on this is that I am not somebody who is particularly good at like marketing or brand identity. Okay. So know that as you listen to my response. My response is much more from the perspective of like, when I go to use an open source dependency or check out what an open source organization or repository is doing, or maybe a company that's working in open source, what I expect to see there as a user or wish to see. So big caveat there. But when I go to an organization page, some of the stuff that I really like to see is, first off, like what is in what way, I guess, is this organization or repository like involved in open source, right? So a lot of times, I think in a lot of marketing things that I see for companies that maybe do a lot of different things, it's difficult to figure out actually what they do sometimes, especially when there's lots of corporate terms of like, oh yes, we're an infrastructure company that helps to support customers with infrastructure needs. It's like, are you talking about bridges or like containers or like orchestration? I don't know. I have no idea what you do. Yeah. So it's really nice to get upfront right off the bat. This is what we do. And then it's also really cool to see, from an organization standpoint, like, here's what our business is, because sometimes that's different than like your open source thing. So like when I go to, the DreamWorks, organization, I kind of already know what they do. So maybe it's not as important to see that. But what I don't know is how they're involved in open source. So again, one of like the first needs that I'm trying to have met, as I go through that page. And then, and I'm personally looking for connection points, right? So if they have any projects in JavaScript or in Golang or in C or C++, then I'm instantly piqued and like, I'm going to check out this project and see what they're doing with it, because it's something that I have a connection point with, and it's almost like meeting a person. You're trying to establish common ground, right? And so, yeah, so I look for that common ground, and it's really nice when people pin the repositories that are sort of their top repositories, so that I can see, okay, these are the ones that they want me to look at. And so I can quickly glance from there. And then the other thing that I wish that everybody did, that I find that hardly anyone does, is to like have a really clear tone in your in all of your writing in the actual README there, or the organization page, because like if you read GitHub's, I love that it has such a GitHub tone, right? It's excited and inviting and all of these things. And I don't want everyone to be that way. I just want everybody to have a tone so that I know how to interact with them. Because if I'm going to open an issue or submit a pull request or something on that, when I've gone to the organization's page, I can match their tone. And again, this is a relationship building thing. If you were to greet me on this podcast, hello, Zachary. It's very nice to meet you today. I wouldn't respond with sup, like a very informal greeting, right? I would notice as a human that you have a certain tone that you're speaking to me with, and I would match your tone so that we can have common ground to stand on in our relationship, and that we'll be better understood. And I don't know, humans just do that mirroring thing, right? Or you're mirroring tone back to each other, or using the same language that somebody else uses. So if I see happy and excited on the GitHub organizations page, when I go to open an issue, I might write an issue with that same tone saying, hey, this is an awesome project. I've just started using it and I love it. Next paragraph, I'm also super confused, emoji, and I could use some help out on this. Is there any resources I could check out before, I sort of asked for further help individually or something like that. And again, if somebody had a more corporate tone and they listed that they're, not accepting contributions or something like that, then I would know before I went and opened an issue and felt like, oh, I got corrected, and shouldn't have done that. So, and there's a good reason for that, right? Like lots of government bodies are like, hey, we want to participate in open source and we want to post the stuff that we're producing as a matter of transparency for the people that we're governing. But, we're not doing open development. And that's not a part of our workflow. And we have, whatever that makes that really difficult, regulation code 629 or 5, whatever. And so then I know how to interact with them. So just sort of setting that stage, setting that tone, and helping people to know, like, where you stand, I think is important.
Yeah, that's great advice. Love that. That's a lot to think about. I think we get quite a few of those things right with the MDN one, but there's some stuff that you've brought up that's like made me pause for a second. I also have my business has an org on GitHub, and it's terrible. Don't look at it. I need to fix it. and then but it's because I've been in limbo as to what I want to do with it. Now that I know, I can do it properly. And then I have a community of early stage developers that I run. That's also an org on GitHub. And again, it needs some love. So this is going to help me when I approach these two. So I think one of the other things that I've struggled with, and something that's mentioned in the repository, is how critically important it is for an OSPO to talk about the things that they've achieved in a given period. And I know also some open source projects that's, for example, funded via something like Open Collective. For them, that's also critical because that's how their sponsors, how they justify their sponsorships, right? Like, why should we pay you again? Like, oh, because we've done all these things. But one of the things that's hard is, in an OSPO, I can imagine, I haven't run one or been part of one, but I've been in open source for a while. So I know there's a lot of invisible work that happens, as people term it. What are some of the key metrics that a common OSPO would use to keep track of and report on?
That's a great question. And I feel like the answers are as varied as people's motivations for having an OSPO, because sometimes we use metrics to accomplish our mission, but especially when OSPOs are getting started, sometimes they tend to steer towards using metrics to rationalize their existence. And by that, I mean the job functions and the fact that you have an OSPO and you're paying people to run that and spend their time on that. So I think for the people who are trying to justify the OSPO's existence, metrics look a lot more like compliance, right? So legal compliance. Are we complying with all the open source licenses for things that we're using? Sort of this get clean motion, right? We need to make sure that we clean up anything anywhere where we're not complying. And getting good standing with our open source licenses, and sort of this get to 100% and then keep it there and stay clean. And so I've seen a lot of metrics around completion for that, 0 to 100%, or 0 to however many licenses or projects you're using as dependencies. So, and then I think from more established OSPOs that maybe aren't trying to rationalize their own existence, or they feel really well supported by their leadership, they tend to focus a little bit more on the mission, a little bit more on like, we've open sourced this project and we're building a community around it. And it has this purpose, and we really want to help to tend to that project by monitoring community health. And they define community health as, whatever it is that they define that as, but, things like, number of open PRs per week or per month or per year, to say that, okay, there's activity going on and healthy community has activity. But it also has productive activity. So how many of those PRs are getting merged? How many of these issues are getting closed as completed, versus closed as just like, no, we're not going to do that. And response time is a really big one that I see. So time to first response on an issue, time to first review on a PR, and time to actually, resolving that PR from when it's opened, or resolving that issue from when it's opened. So that gives you a pulse on the community's cadence. And then you can say whether that meets your expectations for a healthy community or not. So obviously that's really varied as well. But yeah, I've seen a lot of that sort of community measurement, and then license measurement, and then the other thing that I've seen too is folks focus on more of a developer happiness. And I think this comes out of a lot of like the space metrics and state of DevOps report type of metrics, where developer happiness has come up a lot. And organizations are increasingly trying to say like, well, I'd really like to up my developer retention. Like, I'd like people to stay here longer and be happy working here. And so, like, what can we do? And OSPO can play a huge role in that, right? Because it's one of those lever points, like security teams, right? OSPO or security teams or legal, they can all choose to say, lock everything down and only allow via written exception, with all of this rationale, what's allowed to be done in this company. And so people start to think like, oh, can I say this? How do I get my job done? Oh, there's all this red tape. What hoops do I have to jump through and all that type of stuff? Or they could take more of a self-service approach, right? Where it's like, here's the guidelines, here's what we're trying to do. And we extend a certain amount of trust to developers. And so here you go. Serve yourself by following this open source release checklist before you release something, which may have something like, review all your code commits, make sure the commit messages and the code itself doesn't have anything offensive or anything proprietary, that kind of stuff. Pretty standard stuff. But the unique thing is that the developer is trusted to go through that themselves, right? It's not an audit of some external third-party thing, right? That there's actual developer trust. And developers are really happy with that. They feel empowered to be able to get the thing done that they set out to do, which is open source this project that they've been working on. So, taking a enablement approach, I think, is really important when you're thinking about these metrics that OSPOs are using and how they set up measuring themselves. Because we should have a goal. And then we should try and measure with metrics how we're doing against that goal versus the other way around, right? Like letting our metrics of drive things. Because it's easy to say you have 100% license compliance if you don't allow anyone to use any open source projects as their dependencies. Or maybe you have such a long form to fill out if they want to that they don't do it. So they either don't tell you and your metrics look great, or they don't do it and your metrics look great. So yeah, sad either way.
Yeah. Well, that's great stuff. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, it's tough to find those metrics and making them be meaningful. And like you said, not just a way to try and signal something like, look at our metrics. It looks great. But, if you start poking at them, then it's like, oopsie, yeah, you weren't supposed to look there. That kind of stuff. So yeah, goal and then the metrics that lead to that goal makes a lot of sense. So another thing that I saw in there, and there's there's a lot of documents touching on policy, and that's a whole podcast in itself, policies and licenses. So we won't dig into it too much. But the one thing that I'm curious about is the concept of a contributor license agreement. So I have contributed to a Lighthouse from Google, and when I did, I had to sign one of these. It's really easy to do. Like there's like GitHub action and things, and you sign a form, and 2 days or so later, you're like, okay, cool, we can accept your contribution. So it's not a painful thing. It wasn't painful, but it was interesting because I don't encounter it a lot. So I'm curious, like when do you introduce a CLA? Is there a point in time when you introduce it, or is it, what governs a decision around that kind of thing?
Yeah. Even the way that the question is framed too, right? That points to scale, right? When do you introduce it? Like, it's kind of obvious you wouldn't introduce a CLA for an open source project that you're like, yeah, this served my needs, and it's been 6 months and nobody has looked at it. It has one GitHub star and it's mine, type of thing. No CLA needed. You don't even have contributors yet. But I think especially when you look at, and I'm saying that in the terms of it like a personal project, right? When you look at releasing something as an open source project on behalf of a organization, that organization is going to have a certain legal risk tolerance of accepting contributions, because it's frankly a security and a legal risk surface if you're ingesting contributions, right? So let's say I've open sourced a core part of what GitHub.com uses, for doing whatever, and people can now inject their code into that, malicious or otherwise, right? And so, yeah, we just have to think about this. It's really unfortunate. That's the world we live in. So CLAs come in trying to make sure that you're sort of playing by the rules that are the bare minimum for that contribution to be accepted by the open source project, right? And so companies are really worried about this. So they're the ones with CLAs because they don't want to accept something that they shouldn't, because maybe it's got a patent on the code. Let's say you wrote some code, you patented that algorithm in the code that you wrote, and then you try to contribute that to an open source project, and then you sue that open source project for using your patent without permission, and they need to pay you lots of money. And oh my gosh, like what a mess, right? This is not productive open source. But is it allowed, right? How's that court case going to go? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. So, but this sort of stuff happens. So what people are looking for when they add a CLA to their project is really, based on my understanding, I didn't invent these things, but, is like, is this your code that you wrote and that you own and that you have the right to contribute to this project so that I don't get in trouble by using it? And you grant me, permission to use that code. It's not a forgery. It's not malicious intent or whatever, all that kind of stuff. So that's what they're looking for, is that sort of authenticity and that sort of statement and commitment. And then when you've signed that, presumably in some legal case down the road that happens, they can point back to that and say, well, when you submitted this code as a contribution, you made an attestation or a commitment to us that this was your code. And so we had no reason to believe otherwise, but, your buddy wrote it or something like that, and he didn't want it to be put in that project. So, so it's a form of protection. I would really encourage people to look, though. One of the things that we've listed on the GitHub OSPO repository is that, we've brought attention to the fact that there are terms and conditions of using GitHub, just like for everybody on GitHub. So this doesn't include GitLab or others, at least that I'm aware of. I haven't read their terms and conditions. I don't know. But at least for GitHub, that when you contribute code to a repository, it's called like incoming equals outgoing or something like that, where your code that you're contributing is under the license that that project operates in. I cannot say that, well, okay, my code that I contributed to your project, well, that was licensed as GPL v3. And so, now everything is going to be GPL v3 or anything weird like that, right? It's got to be, it's implicitly licensed under whatever the repository license is. So a lot of companies, when they look at that, they go, oh, well, maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need CLAs. And GitHub has actually made this decision. We don't need CLAs. We don't have CLAs on any of our projects because we feel that the terms of conditions of like, okay, well, we open source all of our projects as MIT, or at least the vast majority of them is MIT, which is a very permissive license. So we know that we're accepting contributions under MIT, which is a very permissive license, which is great for us because we can use it in all these ways that are okay with the license, and we don't have to worry about adhering to a bunch of extra hoops to jump through, right? So so that's sort of GitHub's unique perspective. The Linux Foundation, Google, several other, especially large-scale OSPOs would say that CLAs are maybe very important. GitHub just doesn't hold that perspective. And kind of like I described earlier, that like GitHub doesn't have as many rules and regulations as a lot of other companies that are big in tech. And so we act differently, to each their own personality. So, yeah.
Great. That makes it super clear. I understand it much more. Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. So there's one other thing there that I found interesting, and it talked about I think it called it small code exceptions. And I think I understand what that means. But then the other thing that was interesting to me, and I haven't heard the phrase before, is registering your contribution. So I was thinking it maybe that relates to the CLA. So I was just a little unclear. So I was thinking maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I should probably elaborate on this because that is super unclear. But like if I shut off the context of like how we internally do open source at GitHub, where we have this like registration process, it's not like you must get an approval. It's like a registration. You're just saying, hey, I'm open sourcing this and I've looked at the self-service list and I'm good to go. Thanks. Like, there's not like this, super cool rubber stamp or anything like that we used to approve and act as a gate for open source releases, right? So that's what we mean by open source registration. So when we posted this repository, it's a mix of like what we use internally and what we've suggested that other people use. So to that purpose, we've sort of redacted the GitHub name out of everything and said like your company or company name or whatever it is. And so, yeah, I should probably add some clarifying comments about what we mean by registration, because while that's clear to Hubbers, people that work at GitHub, it's not super clear to anyone else.
Yeah, but that's good. I mean, that brings up a question for me. Like, would that be useful feedback that you'd like people to open an issue for, like on the repo and say, I read this thing and I'm really don't quite understand it. Could you clarify? Would that be welcomed?
Yeah. Contributions are welcome, and those contributions specifically are more than welcome. And what we're really looking to do is help OSPOs get started. And if OSPOs don't understand what the heck we were trying to say, then that's not very good for us to help them get started, is it? So yeah, that would be a real big improvement.
All right, super. So there are a lot of other documents in the repository. There's like way too many for us to cover in a single episode. So what would you consider to be the most critical of the documents and processes to find?
So I'm going to take this one personal, I guess. And I have a special heart for the open source presence document that tells people how to set up their open source organization and the organizational readme.github and all of that kind of stuff, and ask them to add an avatar of their company logo into their thing. Because sometimes I just struggle so much with like I sort of have this part of my brain that's like an email spam filter, or, just spam call filter, or whatever it is, right? And so if I were to go to, and this is not the case with Google, I'm just going to use them as an example of like an open source organization on GitHub. But if I were to go to Google's open source organization page, github.com/Google, like I would not believe that it's them if their company logo wasn't there, if they weren't like verified that they actually own google.com, all of this kind of stuff. And there are companies out there that are doing their best, honestly, to start their OSPO, get involved in open source and all this stuff. But too many times I've met with OSPOs and they say, yeah, we've been working on this for 3-4 years. We're starting to feel some momentum. They're maybe overly internally focused. And it's really awkward to bring up, like, so when were you guys going to like upload an avatar to your like little picture so that people believe it's actually you in your organization, and they're not contributing to like some false, like somebody name squatting on your organization's namespace, right? And oh man, it's just such an awkward conversation. If I personally and selfishly, if I could save myself from those conversations and people could just use this document to go through and say, yeah, I've got my organization verified, I've got my README, everything looks really good and in brand on GitHub. Oh my gosh, my life would be better. Yeah. So until then, I'm stuck having awkward conversations.
Okay, folks, read the document and make Zach's life a little easier.
Yes, please.
Well, Zach, this was an awesome conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. There's so much knowledge and wealth in everything here. Like, I can't wait to share it with everybody. In closing, in your time spent setting up and running OSPOs, like, what are some of the biggest mistakes and learnings that you can share?
Awesome. Well, yeah. So thanks for having me. I've been super excited to have this conversation, and been looking forward to it for the whole week it's been scheduled. So thank you for that. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff, and especially in an environment where we're all trying to figure out how to do this, right? We're all flawed humans trying to wander through the world. And so this helpful open source spirit, I've appreciated that you have that. There's so many folks out there, when I tell them I work for GitHub, they're like, oh yeah, you guys have gone corporate or owned by Microsoft, all this stuff. It's like, oh my gosh, like we're just trying to make it in the world. I don't know. So yeah, I appreciate that, Tim. But yeah, so as far as like biggest mistakes and learnings for running OSPOs, honestly, I think that I think it's Einstein, maybe there's a quote from him that says something to the effect of like, spending 90% of your time, or maybe 99% of your time, focusing on getting the problem right, and then just the 1% of your time on solving it. That's the big thing that I've seen OSPOs make that mistake, where it's like, okay, you've been going for 3-4 years, you've been going for 10 years, or maybe you're just getting started and you're honestly just like walking in this direction that's not helpful to your mission, right? I'm not trying to say what you should do as an OSPO, but what you've self-professed that you want to accomplish, you're walking in a direction that's not that. And there's all sorts of like really complex reasons and influences and environmental pressures and all that stuff for why OSPOs do that. But if you want to really work openly and collaborate openly, and that's your goal, then your metrics, your programs that you're running, your things that you're reporting up to your senior leadership, the things that you're asking your developers to do, should all point back to this. Google, I think, is the one who started this like objective and key results thing, where you've got some objective that you're working towards, and then you've got key results that like measure your progress towards that objective. And working myself in an OSPO at GitHub, I'll always ask myself with each thing that I'm undertaking as I start something new, like, what objective is this serving? And what is this helping to accomplish? Not only does that motivate me to actually like do the thing and do it really well, whatever the task is I'm trying to do, but it also helps me understand when to say no. Admittedly, not something I'm super good at, saying no. Check out some of Mike McQuaid's blog posts if you want to learn how to be better at that. I'm still learning, but it does help me consider when I should say no if something isn't really helping to make progress on one of my objectives that I'm trying to do. And whether that's like big objectives like mission goals for the OSPO and why it's there, or our company and why it exists, or whether that's just what I'm trying to do this quarter, or this, whatever you measure your goals on this year. So I think if folks could focus on that, then we would waste less time in our careers. Our careers, they have bookends. They don't go on forever. And we've only got so much time in it. And to make that time impactful and to accomplish your mission, that's what I see as like really beautiful. Like we were talking about with Chris at Google, if it's so clear to me that he accomplished so many impactful objectives there. And as a person, when you talk to him, you also get that, like, he's not somebody who professes to talk openly and do openly and have that open source transparency spirit. He lives it in your conversation, right? He'll be open and transparent with you about his feelings. He's not going to hide that, but he's also going to say it in a really kind and encouraging way, right? So, I'm constantly chasing after that type of authenticity and relevance, things that really make an impact, because otherwise it's just it may get you a good performance review, it may make your company happy, but it's not good for your legacy and your impact on the industry, and it's ultimately not good for your company either. Like they're not, if they're not getting that impact out of it, you're just checking the boxes or whatever, making all the color codes turn green on your metrics. Like, yeah, you got to get out of that as quick as you can.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a great place to end it. Thanks again, Zack. This was really great. I'm glad to hear that you were excited to talk about it. I was excited to learn more, and I've learned a lot. So this has been super awesome, and I can't wait to share with the community. Thanks so much, and thanks for the work you do at GitHub, and thanks for the work that GitHub does. I, for one, appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Mechanical Ink podcast. Join the conversation on Discord. All the links are in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share it with your friends and colleagues. If you have a moment, please leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts, as this helps others find us and helps us make a better podcast for you, our listeners.